the 12th of November, 1944. Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Rain drips from black pine mist strung between trunks like wire. A faint hiss rides the field line, and Lieutenant Lengfeld holds the Bakelite to his ear glove, creaking breath held. The map is soft with damp. Pencil marks bleed at the edges. A code strip curls beneath a stone. Somewhere to his left, a shovel taps twice and stops. The wire gives him the smallest click life, then settles into the low hum that means the company is still stitched together. He counts the beats between bursts, the way a man counts his own breaths, one transmission, then another closer too many. Metric X is climbing. Somewhere across the draw, not seen, but felt in the pacing of the net, something wakes. He thinks of the oath said aloud only once: do not pull a man back into darkness without a line to guide him home. In the Hürtgen, darkness is at noon. The trunks stand like pillars of wet iron. Boots slide in black soil slicked with needles. The smell of wet canvas and warming phenolic hangs in the dugout. The handset is cold and clean against his cheek. Sound is a ruler here, clicks and gaps and tiny breaths of side tone until a new sound stabs through it, not on his net at all, but bleeding across the forest like a match struck in fog. A quick FM, squelch-pop, then another, then a string, crisp and indifferent. Wire hum, then the shock again, squelch-pop, mortar far off like a door slammed in a stone house. He looks up, imagining the whip of an unseen antenna ghosting past the trees. The line hisses. A runner coughs into a sleeve. In the grey distance, a flat American fragment cuts clean through the rain, cable cut. Switch to set. Ghost, net up. Move. The promise of lines begins to feel thin. The forest answers with silence. The count of breaths shortens. The forest pretends to be a place for craftsmen. Lay a perfect line. Tie it round a route map, each fork of the trench with a number, and the world will answer when you tap the handset. That is the promise of discipline married to wire. Men train months to read the faintest side tone to splice in the rain without looking down to memorize code words so that nothing crude ever enters the net. You pay for that beauty in hours, and hands reel after reel carried under trees that shed steel when shells burst in the canopy. 2 runners to guard the layer, a third to find the break when the ground rucks up under blast. Every meter is labor. Every branch that snaps is a new failure point. In the Hürtgen, the bill comes due every hour. Across the draw, the Americans do not ask the forest for permission. They unwrap a backpack set and let VHF carve a channel through the damp air. The set is not lovely. It looks like a tool thrown together for a job the same day it was imagined. A box, a whip, a dial that clicks in coarse steps, a handset with a cord that will not lie politely. Even the way they speak into it sounds rough, like yard hands yelling across a dock. But the signal cuts through the needles clean. The range in this maze of timber is not what the manual promises across flat ground, but 3 miles of practical reach in broken terrain is a new geometry. It ties outposts that wire cannot reach before dark. It ties a squad that just moved, without asking signals first. The old contempt rises easily. Rough sets, heavy, wasteful, crude, no proper economy of materials. A company issued with radios like ration biscuits because they cannot train finesse. That is the inward sneer, the last glove of pride. Then the handset in Lengfeld's palm warms, and the wire gives a small cry like a bird caught in a hedge, and the line dies where a tree just fell. The men whose hands made that line will have to crawl to it in the black and patch it with their teeth chattering on the tape. The contempt tastes thin. Hour by hour, the difference feels less like equipment and more like a choice made far from this wood. Somewhere on the enemy's coast, they decided that perfection would be priced out of the war. They bought crudity in bulk. They taught corporals to use VHF like a shovel. They stamped out tens of thousands of the same backpack set and threw them forward until the air between trees was threaded by things you cannot see. The figure you hear in rumour, 50,000 and more, is not a number. It is a weather change. It means that when a wire dies, their net does not. It means the platoon leader who took a wrong trail speaks to the one who did not. It means a map error can be corrected with a sentence, and not a runner's life. He looks down at his own map where damp has turned fine pencil to grey moss. The wire routes are exact. The plan for a fallback line is exact. The men who learned these routes can walk them blind. Precision is a comfort blanket pulled over a problem that has moved. The problem is speed. While a German section spends 20 minutes feeling for the brake and tying silk to copper under a root ball, the American patrol folds into a new shape because a dial moved one click. Their set steps across channels in 200 kHz bytes, 40-odd choices, each a door through the same wall. You can hear it if you stand still long enough. A short squelch pop, then voices swap places, then another pop, and the mortar plot arrives on a different wire of air. The forest does not care for elegance. It cares for who finishes the sentence first. A shell tears in the canopy. Wood splinters flick across the trench like thrown nails. The wire hisses and goes mute. The silence is not quiet. It grows. He knows the drills. Send the spare reel. Shift to the alternate route marked in grease pencil. Record the break on the log. All of that assumes the break wants to be found, and that the next tree will not fall on the new span. Meanwhile, the enemy's radio net gets brighter as if someone turned a lens to focus. The words are still rough, the cadence is clipped and indifferent, but the speed is obscene. A squad that saw a shadow calls at once. A second squad answers from a flank. A third, that was supposed to be a mile behind, is suddenly 15 minutes nearer, because the jeep with another set rode up a track no one had mapped. Men and machines move because the air is carrying orders with no wire to kill. He has read the pamphlets on American industry. He disliked them for the same reason a violinist dislikes a factory horn. 1,000 hands stamping the same part is not mastery, it is surrender. But the forest makes a case that the city has already decided. The enemy can afford to lose sets in the rain because there is another on a table 2 valleys back, batteries lined like bread. He can afford to let corporals speak decisions because hearing each other at once blunts the cost of a mistake. In a doctrine where a line must be laid before a thought can move, thought arrives late and breathless. In theirs, thought is already at the corner by the time his men reach the bend. Another squelch pop knifes the air, and seconds later a mortar claps somewhere off the left, like a door slammed in a stone house. The timing makes the stomach lurch because it means the call, the shift, the plot and the firing happened while his line was still dead wood. He has been told all his soldiering life that control is a moral act. Hold fast, keep your nets clean, never let the line wander. He looks at the handset and knows he is holding a prayer book in a flood. It is not that his men are less brave or less exact. It is that bravery and exactitude are being spent in the wrong currency. He forces the contempt to speak once more because habit is a shelter. Rough sets, he thinks, and the word feels small in his mouth. Rough because they are not polished. Rough because no one sings to them before dawn. Rough because they survive being dropped in a ditch and still talk to 4 squads at once. The word is not an insult anymore. It is a description of a thing designed to meet the world as it is. What betrays him is not the set in his hand, but the idea behind it. Perfection promised invulnerability, if you paid enough attention. The bill was a tension that could not be sustained under trees that bleed steel in rain that eats insulation on ground that moves. Across the drawer the price was paid in advance in stamped cases and coarse dials and batteries stacked by the 1,000, so that the platoon could make mistakes at speed and still live. There is a noise of feet in mud behind him, the relief squad coming up with a fresh reel. He wants to thank them for their care and send them back before the next burst. The coil thumps down. He hears very faint the first test tone on the new line, hopeful and pure. It lasts 3 seconds. Then squelch pop, then the shell. The wire goes dark again. He does not say anything. The men are already moving the way trained men move, hands on tasks, eyes down, voices level. He feels the betrayal not in them, but in the space between trees, where the enemy's rough voices redraw the fight faster than craft can repair it. In a different war, the discipline that shaped these hands would have been enough. In this one, the forest keeps score in radios, per kilometer per hour, and precision that cannot multiply itself becomes a kind of pride that gets men killed. They stepped at last, light 10 men, moving in a single file, with the care of locksmiths, each boot placed, where the man ahead had placed his, each breath measured to the needles underfoot. The plan had the clean geometry of a drawing board hug the shallow ditch that folded away from the company line, pass behind the root churn, where the last barrage had thrown a maple sideways hook around the American listening post on, the knuckle of high ground, and take 1 prisoner, who could tell them how far the enemy had crept into the timber. Wire discipline would carry the thought back along the trench when they returned. The handset in Lengfeld's pocket felt like a promise. Night in the Hürtgen is not dark so much as granular a blackness that has texture and weight. Rain ticked on needles. Somewhere far off a generator coughed. He could map his men by memory the point, with a captured trench knife held low. The second man with the short spade, the third carrying the reel for the return span, the runner half a file back tense with the need to prove speed after yesterday's lecture about wasted minutes. They moved until the ditch bent right where the map said it would, then pressed flat, and waited for the small noises that betray a post that thinks itself alone. The first success was fine work. They found a wire laid careless across the top of the ditch, lifted it with a twig, slipped it under a root. The point man froze with one knee on a rock and listened until his own pulse stopped being a drum, then slid forward and touched a boot with the blade. The American on watch never made a sound. The second man's palm covered a mouth, a third hand closed on a wrist, and two shapes were drawn into the ditch and bound before the needles above them had settled. The quiet felt like competence turning into safety. He tapped the handset twice, a pre-arranged tick that meant nothing in the clear. The return line back toward the company waited. They would move the prisoners 500 meters, then lay a quick span along the ditch for a clean pullback. The runner brushed past and was gone down the line a shadow carrying the message that the fish was on the hook. The forest answered with a sound that did not belong to it. A brief clinical squelch-pop, then another at an angle that made no geographical sense if there was only one enemy post. Voices came next, not loud, not urgent, just the low diction of men handing off a task they had repeated too many times to lend it drama. The words themselves could not be pulled from the wet air at this distance, but cadence carries its own content. One caller pause, the same voice answering farther to the left, as if it had cloned itself, a third voice that sounded like a man turned on his heel and spoke over his shoulder while still walking forward. The ditch tightened around the patrol, as if the earth had taken a breath before coughing. Lengfeld put the handset to his ear. The wire hummed alive, and then the faintest cry ran along it like a bird startled in a hedge. He squeezed his eyes shut and counted, expecting the tone to return as it always did after a branch fell. It tried to come back twice thinned to nothing the third time and went out. The runner would be at the last elbow of the trench, he thought, hands on the span, ready to reroute it around the fallen maple. He nodded to the man with the reel. The gesture was small, but everything in the patrol rested on it. Lay the span, now tie us back to the line, make the return reel. The reel turned once and jammed. Wet bark had bitten the silk-wrapped copper and kinked it. The man swore inwardly, chewed a glove finger loose with his teeth, and tried to free the bite without moving his shoulders above the ditch's lip. His hands shook. He pressed them flat to the mud to steady them. The tremor transmitted through soil to Lengfeld's forearms. The wire came free, slid a meter, caught again, where fire had lifted a patch of ground and set a root arching. He cut, stripped, twisted bit, and taped with breath he could not spare his tongue, tasting resin and rubber. When he finished, the handset gave a flat purity that lifted the whole patrol an inch closer to belief. Squelch-pop answered from the trees as if the forest objected to hope on principle. Then another closer, and a third from behind their right shoulder, an impossible place, unless the enemy had stepped around them while the wire was being fed through the ditch. Mortars began to speak in the distance, not yet on them, but the rhythm telegraphed. Intention, one correcting round, a call, two, bracketing shots, another call, then the first six, coming together so fast the forest could not decide which way to jump. The prisoners stiffened under the hands that held them. One whispered something that made the second try to nod with his whole head despite the glove across his mouth. Lengfeld knew the look. He had seen it on his own men when they could hear coordination happening outside their control. He forced himself to keep the scale of the problem human-sized. The enemy had at most a platoon out in this rain. Their radios could not make more men grow from trees, but they could make the same men appear to be many by handing a sighting off like a chain of firecrackers, each burst passing the heat to the next. A squad across the draw said what it saw. A second squad shifted toward the left like a hand turning a page. A third, which doctrine would have held in reserve 2 fields back, was already half the distance closer because a jeep had pushed up a skidding track carrying another set and extra batteries on a blanket. He could hear the quick clicks as channels were traded 200 kHz steps, opening and closing like shutters. The runner had not returned. Lengfeld marked the time since he had vanished into the black and decided he was lost to the lattice of roots and old shell holes that grab a man's ankles when he thinks only of speed. He considered sending the spare, and a piece of him, the part that loved tidy solutions, had already lifted a hand when the first of the bracketing mortars hit. It crashed a tree somewhere downslope with a sound like a long cupboard emptying onto stone. Splinters walked up the ditch wall and pricked men's cheeks. The handset went dead again. The man with the reel made a small sound in his throat that was not fear so much as the pain of good work made irrelevant. He slid along the ditch until his shoulder touched the bound American nearest him. The man's eyes had the wide whites of a horse before thunder. Lengfeld did not speak. He had nothing to say that would move weight through this wood faster than the enemy's ghosts could pass it. Instead, he scanned the trunks for the sight he had imagined in daylight, and hated himself for how right it felt. Now the thin whip of an antenna slipping between pines there, and gone a line that did not care about roots or wet bark or fair, pretty knots. The patrol fell back a dozen meters to a bend where the ditch steepened enough to give them a roof. The man at the splice set a new joint with the deliberation of a surgeon who knows a patient is bleeding out but refuses the sin of haste. His hands steadied when his jaw set. He cinched the tape, pressed the seam, thumbed the handset to test. A tone returned, this one warmer, and for 3 seconds the night was a room with a light on. Then squelch-pop, clinical and unashamed, and the next mortar cracked so close, the air itself seemed to harden, and the handset spoke only its own small death. They lay there with their faces full of dirt, and their mouths full of sap, and counted the gaps between the enemy's calls. It occurred to him that timekeeping had become the war's truest skill. The Americans measured in transmissions and handoffs. His men measured in seconds won by craft against things that could not be tied down. The runner's slot in the file remained an absence. The prisoners breathed too fast, and then too slow, a pendulum of useless adjustment. Someone farther back in the patrol tried to relight a cigarette 3 times, and then put the stub away like a guilty bead. A whole company in this sector had learned to live with redundancy, built of FM. He had seen it on the other side of the lines. At the start of the Ardennes, push a battered platoon, still talking after its first set, drowned in a creek. Men passing the handset like a canteen from foxhole to foxhole. Another set on a jeep acting as a relay at a hairpin bend. A third slung on a messenger who never stopped running because stopping made him hear himself think. Those were memories from a different week and a different map square, but the logic was the same here. If one voice fails, 2 others arrive without ceremony. The ghost nets do not ask permission of the ground. He had told himself discipline was the answer to saturation. Hold the file tighter, drill the signs harder, protect the wire with more care and more men. The night proposed a colder arithmetic. Every man you assign to shepherd a span is a man not listening for the next squelch. That means the mortars are moving from search to destruction. Every lesson in finesse is a minute of life exchanged for the right to keep calling it finesse. The men in his file had given themselves to that ideal with a willing ferocity. Their hands showed it even now, blood slicked from a splice done blind, unhappy fingers working tape into a seam. They could not bring themselves to leave, imperfect even under incoming fire. When the mortar line finally lifted and walked backward into the trees, it did not feel like a reprieve so much as a pause between breaths. The air held the memory of the shock. The wire was dark. The runner was still an absence at his appointed place. Lengfeld touched the handset to his ear one more time out of habit and heard nothing, then let it rest against his chest, as if weight alone might persuade it to speak. They moved again, this time without the neatness of the first advance. The prisoners had to be dragged. The ditch undercut unexpectedly and dropped a man to his elbow. A branch snagged a cap cord and nearly stripped it off. In that chaos they still tried the small rituals. A hand flattened to still a shaking wrist. A glance passed down the file like a silent yes, because ritual is what keeps a body from admitting it, is tired enough to make mistakes. None of it altered the truth that swam up from the wet earth. The careful patrol had outpaced its doctrine, and doctrine was too proud to run. Far to the left, a voice came clean through the rain American level, and close enough now that words could be understood if you wanted to carry them home. It was the kind of sentence that sounds like nothing and moves a company shift, right 2 trees, stand by smoke, count 5 on my mark. Another squelch pop, a new angle, the same voice again, as if it had been waiting there all its life. He recognized the pattern and felt the first drop of real shame cool on the back of his neck. Not because he had failed, he had done what a good officer does in a bad place, but because men under him were spending their courage to hold positions defined by lines that would not hold for them. They reached the final bend before their own lines. The last splice lay ready, bright copper wet with rain tape torn to length, the man's hands finally steady from exhaustion, if not from confidence. He made the join with a small care that would have earned praise on parade ground. The handset woke. A voice from the company trench answered before he could speak, relief crashing through words that tripped on one another in their hurry to exist. He had time to say, "We have 2 prisoners and 1 missing." Then the pop came so close now that the reed of the antenna seemed to vibrate in his teeth, and the door slam of a shell hammered the soil beyond the bend, and the line fell away. Again, as if someone had pulled it by the tail into the ground. They carried the prisoners the last 20 meters by faith. The first friendly face in the trench had mud stuck in his lashes and a smile that looked like a cut. Men took the bound shapes and vanished, already asking for names they would not remember. Someone asked about the runner. Lengfeld opened his mouth and closed it. He set the dead handset down on the table and wiped his gloves clean with a motion that polished nothing. The forest beyond the parapet made its old, small sounds, rain ticking a branch, resetting a pebble, rolling 3 inches as if the night had been merely interested in a game and would choose another now. He could feel the question gathering in the dugout like fog. What to do about a world in which craft buys you seconds and the enemy buys minutes by the 1,000? He did not answer it aloud. He would have to stand up in an hour and send men out again. The wire would be spliced again and fail again because wood and iron and rain would keep their contract with gravity, and the air would keep its contract with the crude boxes that used it. The discipline he loved would continue to be paid out coin by coin into a slot that had been jammed by someone else's factory long before his patrol stepped off. That was the trap. He knew it not as an opinion, but as something he could feel in his hands, which had stopped trembling only because there was, for a moment, nothing left for them to do. The encirclement did not announce itself. It accumulated. A contact whispered on the left became 2 on the right, that should not have been able to move that fast in this terrain. A gap in the mortar rhythm widened like a mouth, and then closed in a new place. A voice from a foxhole that had always answered first, answered last, and then did not answer at all. The map said the line bent like a crooked elbow. The forest said the elbow was now a noose. Lengfeld held the handset to his cheek and tasted salt where rain had found his lips. The wire gave him only the soft hush of its own body. He could hear men in the trench doing the decent things that kept fear in house order, shaking water out of a sleeve, clearing a throat, nudging a small rock with a boot so no one would trip in the next rush. He tried the alternate span again, the one they had plotted 3 days ago under a tarp, and the result was a clean blank that made his stomach turn. The second squad was somewhere between a shallow saddle and the stump garden where a Jew 88 had come apart years ago. They were not gone. They were not reachable by anything made of copper. On the air, the enemy was pruning itself. Short, squelch pop, then a voice that had become familiar not by tone but by the way it respected time. He counted automatically 2 seconds between calls, then 1, then a stutter that meant someone had stepped into somebody else's slot. The correction was instant. A click, another pop, and what had been on 1 number was now 6 steps higher, a hop of 200 kilohertz at a time, smooth as a hand sliding across a tabletop. He did not know the American names for those channels, and refused to give them his own, but the math was not complicated. If you can step between rungs faster than a man can cut your ladder, you keep climbing. A runner came in chest first, the rest of him attached by will and a strap. Mud painted his teeth. He had the look of someone who had made a bargain with the ground to carry messages as long as he was allowed to keep one knee. He tried to salute and failed because the arm would not rise. "Second squad is pressed," he said, each word tugging past a stitch in his side. "Left and right both." The span won't hold. Trees coming down. They're hearing sets all around them now. Where Lengfeld said, because locating a pain is the first step to living with it. Between the blown log and the sinkhole, the runner said, and blinked twice very quickly. That was a man reporting his own heart rate without knowing it. He would be back out the trench mouth as soon as someone refilled him with breath and something sweet. Lengfeld understood what the next sentence had to be before knowing he could make his mouth form it. There were rules he had written for himself, passes of honor that let you live with the fact that you could order a line to hold after it no longer made sense to hold it. He had held on to one rule because it kept him from becoming the kind of officer he had been trained to despise. He could feel it in his chest as a string drawn across bone. Do not tell men to move without a line. He saw the knight reach in to pluck that string like a finger on a violin, felt the note climb until it threatened to crack, and then he cut it. Second squad pulls back on my mark, he said. No wire. Bearings by sound. Follow the mortars when they lift, cut behind them, while they speak forward. The dugout took in air, as if it had been waiting to see whether he would finally admit that the war was not the one he had studied. No one said anything. They were too well trained to mark the moment aloud. He felt heat in his face an instant, and old-school shame like the kind that rises in a classroom when you give the wrong answer with confidence. His heart ran up the numbers as if chased, hitting a new beat so quickly he had to consciously slow his breath to keep from panting. He wished there were a wire to bite. Pass the word, he said. By mouth. Left hand trench to the saddle. They go on the lift. No voices above a whisper. No steel on stone. The runner nodded and was already aback moving into rain. Lengfeld took the handset and held it to his ear again, not because it worked, but because habit was a rope across a stream. He listened to the nothing and created in it the places where his men would be, the places where the Americans were. The enemy voices were doing what they did when they had enough sets to indulge neatness. A platoon net, talking to a company relay, the relay repeating a request to the weapons line, the weapons line, speaking with the calm of a man who knows. The answer is yes. Then a clean silence, the pause before a reserve channel opens like a door to a private room. He could hear the flip, not a sound so much as a pattern break from a number he had learned to recognize, to another 4 or 6 steps away, and then the same timbre back again as familiar as a neighbour's cough. 12 to 18, he thought, without wanting the numbers in his head, and hated that he felt a kind of admiration for how quickly they made the move without stepping on themselves. He signalled with 2 fingers. The platoon sergeant hated 2-finger signals and preferred full words, but tonight he nodded like a man listening to rain decide to become sleet. Men rose in the trench with that stiffness of soaked wool weapons hugged to chests so metal would not clink. Someone lifted the coil they had tried a dozen times today to snake through roots, thought better of it without being told, set it down as if it were a child finally persuaded to sleep, and moved off with empty hands. He stepped into the cut and tasted the forest at night again. The air had that cooling iron tang it gets after many shells. He set his own bearings by sound, the cheapest instrument, the first one you ever learn, and the last you want to rely on when someone is trying to kill you. Mortars yawned toward the rear in a series that meant nothing to a civilian and everything to a man who had spent too long. With maps, shift right, 2 trees, stand by smoke, count 5, on my mark. The lift came like a curtain raised with one careless hand. He put his palm out just behind his hip and felt the file move as one the way trained men become a single body simply by agreeing not to make noise at the same time. Halfway to the saddle, shock lived up to its name. A tight run of squelch-pops laced the trees just left of the route and then arced over their heads as if a long wire had been thrown in the air and pulled taut. The breath that had been steady in his throat forgot itself. He heard his own pulse inside his ears and had to force the next breath in on a count. The net across from them had not seen them. It was speaking to itself about some other piece of business. But in this wood, where everything you believed came back to you as echo, and scolding the enemy's easy flip to a reserve channel, made him feel like a man in a dress uniform walking into a factory at shift change. They lay flat as the heavy branch came down 3 meters ahead and blew splinters along the ground with enough force to sew small red lines in a man's cheek. Someone gasped, and turned the sound into a cough with a soldier's shame. He checked the faces he could see, and found in each the same question he was asking in himself: is this smart, or is this cowardice dressed as adaptation? He had ordered it. He knew the answer he would give if asked. He still felt the old oath like a bone under skin. It would never dissolve. It would just stop instructing the hand. They made the last yards on their bellies because dignity is cheap and blood is expensive. The first man into the saddle's scoop reached back and pulled two others by their sleeves with a patience that would have looked like love in a different field. Someone passed up a rifle that had gotten free of its owner and did it without letting metal touch the stone lip. Under the smell of wet canvas and old oil was the sour thread of fear turned into sweat, a human truth that refuses to respect rank. The sergeant leaned close and said too softly to be recorded by anything but memory, "We're in. They're not on us." He nodded. The handset he had kept for no reason knocked against his hip and annoyed him like a superstition. He wanted to smash it, and also to sleep with it under his arm like a child's toy. The shame sat behind his breastbone with his heartbeat, which had settled, but not to the numbers that let a man joke. In his mind, he was already composing the sentence he would write if tomorrow existed: withdrawal conducted by sound bearings and enemy lulls due to conditions of ground and air interference. It would be technically correct and morally evasive. He hated it in advance. Voices came again through the trees, the same calm diction. He could now pick out who was who. The way you learn the chorus parts in a hymn, the patrol lead with clipped impatience, the weapons line that never hurried, a relay that dropped articles as if words cost money. A popper shift now, on a number that made the signal brighter, which meant a reserve, or simply another of their boxes opened, because there was no penalty for having many. He wondered who had decided 2 years ago, or 10, to put that many on tables and teach boys to hold them. Whoever it was had reached into this gully tonight and moved his men like pieces on a board. He gathered the file to a knuckle of ground that broke the wind and let them breathe without swallowing needles. The second squad found them by listening to their own mortars speak to someone else and choosing the exact intervals when the sound was greatest to drag their bellies across the exposed path. When they rolled into the scoop, the first thing they did was look for wire out of reflex. They found none. The first face to register that absence flinched as if struck. He did not apologize. He also did not meet the man's eye for a full second. The last element in came bruised and short one helmet. The man who should have been behind them was not. They reported him missing in words they had used too often. The sergeant wrote the name on a small card under his poncho to keep the ink from running. Lengfeld felt the name as weight and set it on the same shelf as his oath. That shelf would need to hold many things by dawn. Behind them, the ditch they had left would already be receiving attention from people who measured life in different units. Someone would be laying a new span because the world made more sense to him if there was a line you could touch. Someone would be feeding out a reel because empty hands make a man feel unemployed at the front. He loved these men for their refusal to stop doing the difficult thing just because it had stopped being rewarded. He could not let their devotion keep dictating the shape of his orders. He turned back toward the company line and let himself think like a thief. The enemy net was holding to a reserve number now brighter, cleaner, which suggested they were preparing to move their own edge. He could run in the space that move created. He told the sergeant they would slide one trunk's width every 15 seconds, counting with their teeth, timing it between the enemy's call and answer. It sounded like nonsense, like a game played by children, to keep courage in their pockets until the first minute passed, and they had gained the length of a foxhole without earning a shell for the trouble. Shame loosened its hold just enough to let breath go out without dragging. At the trench lip, a young private stared as if he had seen a ghost step out of the trees. Lengfeld stepped down and handed the handset to a signalsman, who took it the way a nurse takes a sleeping infant from a father, gentle even when the thing being cradled is only sentiment. He issued the counts, the prisoner note, the missing man's name. Then he said what had to be said hard and plain. We move without wire until the morning. Bearings by sound. We ride their lulls. Reels stay here. No one cheered. It was not a cheering sentence. It was a wedge hammered into the timber of his own house. He could feel the structure absorb it and list a little and not come down because soldiers live in whatever shelter they are handed. He signed the runner's slip with a pencil, so short it left a grey stain on his knuckle. He waited for the old code inside him to ring a bell of alarm so loud it would make him call the order back. It did ring. He let it ring. He stood with the shame and the irrelevance, and decided that if his men were to bleed, they could at least do it on ground chosen by ears, instead of by a doctrine that had outlived the wire it worshipped. Outside the forest resumed its ordinary conversation, rain a twig, a stone. The enemy net popped once, twice, and settled onto yet another number with the ease of men changing lanes on an empty road. Somewhere in the dark, a mortar team broke down a plate and carried it hand over hand to a new patch of soil. He could not hear that, but he knew the taste of what would follow. He put a palm on wet timber and felt it give a small sigh into his hand like a living thing. The shame did not leave. It made room for something harder, a willingness to be wrong yesterday so that men could be alive today. He did not ask the forest for permission. He gave the next order and listened, counting heartbeats for the space in the enemy's chatter where his company could move unseen. They found it at first light where the rain had eased to a hanging mist and the trunks stood black as chimneys. A squat stump made a clean table. On it sat, the American set a box that looked exactly like the insult they had once used without thinking rough. But here in the quiet, after a night spent moving by lulls, Rough had the authority of a tool that had done the work. The whip antenna leaned against bark wet and slender and taller than a man's patience. The channel window showed its coarse arithmetic from 0 to 40 numbers behind scratched plastic each click, a promise that words could find a different path if the first was blocked. A packet of laminated call cards had swollen at the edges and still refused to tear. Someone had sealed their doctrine in celluloid and assumed rain. The handset lay on its cord as if asleep, the Bakelite warm to the touch just from being a body among other bodies. Lengfeld put a glove flat on the case to feel its hum. There was no hum, of course. The batteries were quiet things that gave themselves away only in service. But touch is a liar in the morning, and the set felt like a captured animal that might still twitch. The sergeant eased the lid open. Inside the geometry was brutal and legible blocks, not filigree, screws you could turn with a coin, labels thick enough to read in bad light. This was a language you didn't have to conjugate. It was a sentence that any corporal could say. He looked at the channel drum and imagined last night's flips not as mysterious craft but as simple decisions executed without ceremony. 200 kilohertz per tooth, 41 teeth, a circle of exits. Step, step, step until you're in a room where no one is shouting over you. He turned the drum 2 clicks and stopped, not because he feared a transmission, but because the sound was indecently cheerful in a wood that had eaten men. The doctrinal phrase came out of him before he had time to varnish it. They traded elegance for numbers, and numbers won. No one answered. A statement like that is not for agreement. It is a ledger entry. The sergeant unrolled the call cards with a thumb and showed the little grids, the places where a name would go, and a time, and a short word that carried more weight than its syllables. The cards were laminated against the world. Their care had been spent in advance, so care could be spared at the front edge. "Count it," Lengfeld said. They did. How many sets had they heard on that sliver of front in one night? How many relays? How many voices that never had to wonder if silence meant death, or merely a move to another number? The arithmetic was not official, but it carried the precision of men who know what they just survived. The sergeant used the stump like a clerk. He scratched in the wet wood with a nail. "Sets per kilometer," he wrote without saying it aloud, and tapped the nail after the number as if a period could anchor a truth. The batteries came next. Someone handed him a cell with a paper label wrinkled by weather. BA 70. The men had learned to call it from rumour and captured slips, a number with a habit of staying the same across valleys. 20 hours if they were careful, 25 if the operator was cruel to his own voice. Half that again for a heavier pack. He turned the figure in his head like a coin and translated it into minutes, because that is what a withdrawal counts. Minutes of ordered life, he thought, and set the battery down as if putting a clock back on a mantle so that the house would remember to behave. He looked at his own table in the dugout spools, knives tape, a fragile lamp, and tried to imagine dressing it in lamination and thick letters. It resisted the exercise. Wire asks for devotion. It eats attention as a tax. This box asked for obedience to a simpler idea that many is a kind of mercy. many sets per kilometer, many channels per minute, many batteries per day. The moral neatness he had loved could not keep pace with arithmetic that moved like water. A young private, the same who had shaken water from his sleeves without complaint 3 hours ago, ran a finger along the channel window and smiled in a way that he then crushed on his face as if smiles were contraband. Lengfeld saw it and did not scold. Men respect different things when they are tired. The set had kept the enemy alive long enough to kill his runner, and still it was hard not to admire the brutality of its kindness. He asked for the tally out loud, because saying numbers forces ownership. The sergeant read from the stump 6 distinct platoon voices, in a span that should have held 2 by their doctrine. 2 jeep relays that never once sounded winded. A weapons line that shifted channels 4 times in a minute without stepping on itself. At least one reserve net kept bright and unused until it mattered. He marked it with a short nod that felt like signing a confession. Then he had the sergeant convert the battery hours into what they had felt like in the trench, not endurance, a word for parades, but time during which a voice could make shape out of fear, minutes of ordered life. He liked the phrase less the more it made sense. He lifted the handset. It was heavier than the one he knew because mass had been cheap where it was born. He put it to his ear and listened to the ocean that is always there when a set is not speaking. He thought of all the minutes men had bought with reels and tape and blood under bark, and how many of those minutes had been spent waiting for a line to heal itself. He tried to imagine replacing that waiting with the insultingly linear act of turning a drum, clicking a number, and speaking again. "We will never match their count," the sergeant said, not unkindly. "No," Lengfeld said. "We will stop pretending count is vulgar." He placed the handset back on the set with a small respect that surprised him. A respect for function over grace feels like betrayal if you have been raised on grace. He let the feeling stand and did not argue with it. The set's faceplate, pocked and scuffed, looked back at him with the calm of a thing designed by committee and improved by hands. He could not love it. He could not afford to hate it and keep his men. He asked 2 men to lift it and found it took no ceremony to make it theirs. A captured doctrine is still doctrine. On the stump, the tallies remained like scars, sets per kilometer, channels per minute, batteries to minutes of ordered life. The stump would rot and carry that arithmetic back into the soil. The idea would not rot. It had already moved into his orders without asking. They started back toward the trench. The whip antenna bobbed over a shoulder like a sapling carried home. Rain restarted in a finer version of itself. He walked behind the men and watched the box sway with the body that bore it, a simple pendulum, proving time again and again. He remembered the wire they had left coiled on a shelf and felt affection for it the way a man feels affection for a tool that taught him carefulness. Affection is not policy. At the lip, a voice asked for news, and he answered with the doctrinal sentence he owed his own ghosts. They traded elegance for numbers, and numbers won. He pronounced it cleanly and without bitterness. Bitterness wastes minutes. He added the only measure that would matter after noon. We'll measure by frontage and hours, how many nets per kilometer, how many minutes we can keep a voice alive. In the dugout, the map waited with its wet-edged scratches. He set a pencil down, and drew not lines but circles, rough, overlapping, shameless places, where a box on a back could be, where a second could take its place when batteries quit, where a third could stand on a bend like a lamp at a door. He felt the old pride stir, and object that this was crude. He let it object. Then he wrote the name of the missing runner in a corner, so the map would remember the price of perfection. The set clicked once, as if a phantom hand had tried the drum. No one moved. The morning carried on indifferent, and exact counting minutes the way it always had, whether or not a doctrine approved. By afternoon, the forest had the tired look of a workshop after the bell. Tools lay where hands had dropped them. Puddles remembered boots. Orders moved anyway. He set men by soundposts and bends, not by where a wire could be protected, and watched how quickly a patrol stopped behaving like a bead on a string and started behaving like a web finding its own shape. Once the box was on a back, intent stopped asking permission from terrain. Men chose better ground because they could tell each other why in time to matter. The change was not moral. It was mechanical. A set that allowed a corporal to open his mouth and alter a platoon's geometry in seconds, re-weighted the war toward those willing to act without ceremony. Where wire had demanded stillness to prove virtue, FM rewarded motion that stayed coherent. It turned hold until the line is laid into move while we are speaking, and that grammar favored the army that bought speech in bulk. He read the older pamphlets again that night and felt the weight come off certain sentences. Control remained important. It had only moved its home address. It now lived in density and renewal. How many voices you could keep alive on a frontage per hour. How many batteries you could feed. How many clicks you could make before anyone noticed the door you had chosen. It was unromantic. It was exact. It kept men. The echo would not stop at the woodline. Once you teach small units to speak as they move, you do not ever return to the silence that flattered specialists. Other uniforms would adopt the backpack grammar in new numbers and new housings. Partnerships would write it into peacetime standards, as if it had always been obvious. Sets that owed their bones to the same idea would ride behind different badges, a British pack that felt like a cousin others to follow, all of them paying respect to the proof that speed of instruction at the edge is the first kindness. He tried to make the truth small enough to carry in a pocket. It would fit only if he folded it into a ratio and read it aloud like a prayer nets per kilometer per hour. In that figure lived everything the forest had taught him, that survival became a function of how many overlapping chances you could give a voice to be heard, while the ground tried to make it fail. He wrote it in the margin of the map and let the numbers sit there without flourish. When night came again, the boxes ticked, and the men moved on cues that were no longer ashamed of their simplicity. He could still feel the old code inside him humming like a wire. It did not own him anymore. He gave the next order in the language the war had chosen, and listened for the clean answer that meant a patrol would arrive with the same number of names it had when it left. Radios outran wires. Speed outran perfection. Webs beat lines.